The data being passed back and forth is usually in some format. It's not just random data, and you can pass back and forth text files. But usually when you get to an API, you want some sort of data interchange format. The common ones are XML, which is extremely heavy and difficult to work with, and JSON, which is a much lighter format and it's readable by us humans. Generally, when we write programs, we want something that is in JSON format, and it uses a lot less bandwidth. Certainly, there are lots of applications that actually specify this as their format. For instance, Ethereum uses a JSON remote procedure call. So the incoming data that it's being passed with the parameters is in this format, and its return data that comes back from the server side, the blockchain side, is also in this format. Most of the time when I build applications, that's the format that I want to use because it's much easier to work with and it's human readable. I can build tests that I can read without having to resort to writing custom programs just to input some piece of data that I'm going to manipulate. But these are also text formats. That means that you're not sending things like images or sound or video through these formats. This is the text data, and when you send these other things, generally what you do is you send the URL of the thing, the image that you want to display, or some data that allows the client to construct that URL, and it makes a separate request for these binary data chunks. So, how are parameters passed to the backend? There's a couple different methods. The first one of those is when you make a request, you can put in a question mark and a bunch of parameters on the request. This is the get method request. And in the example here, I have a name of code and a name of name. And it has two values, load and Bob. This is probably one of the easiest ways to pass parameters. But because they want this string to be without blanks, things like blanks have to be encoded with hex values. So you'll see a blank is a %20. And there's a encoding scheme called URL encoding that allows you to take the URL and its parameters and encode all of this stuff so that the receiving end can do the appropriate decode and decode all of this stuff back to the original values. It's somewhat limiting. The size is limited. It's not infinite. And not everything works with this kind of a request. The next most common is XURL encoded, where it sends the request, but it sends with it a body of text that is encoded in this format. Post requests and delete requests use XURL encoded normally as their default. They don't have to. You can send a header that says that instead of XURL encoded, for instance, you're sending JSON data, JavaScript object notation data, as the request body format. So there are other encoding schemes that get used. They're not as common, but those are the big ones. Also, I mentioned that the length of these things is limited. They're not really suitable for doing things like file uploads. When we do a file upload, we switch to a different format that is based off of email attachments. And the email attachment format has lots of advantages in that since it's built for big things, it allows us to upload files. So instead of having to send it all as one chunk like these others do, it can send it in little pieces, one piece at a time, and still get the data to the destination. So file uploads use a different format. Now, if we go back to our Django Python example, we'll see that there is things in the middle of those where it says articles in ear. And these are positional parameters. In this case, they've been typed to be an int or something like whatever the type a slug is there on the last one. So these positional parameters are another way that we could pass data from the front end to the back end. This has mixed blessings and problems. There's really good results out of language research to indicate that above a certain number, about 4 parameters, it becomes easier for people to use named parameters like slug equals and then whatever the slug value is. So Putting them in that fashion would make it easier on the users. When you have when you have positional parameters, it basically requires that whoever is going to make this call to this endpoint has to look up how they work in some documentation, and it's easy to transpose the positions and get them wrong. It also makes the routing really difficult on the server side, because you'll notice that the way that Django works is the longest route wins. So something that's articles 2001, 03, and then whatever a slug is would get routed to before the one that's shorter. So it uses longest wins. Other systems use the first match wins. So you have to know something about the router and how it works, but all of these things make the routing quite difficult to do and time intensive. Whereas if this were just everything is routed to an endpoint up to wherever that question mark is, and the parameters after it are the parameters, that's a much simpler router and a faster router to run and use. I tend to favor putting all the parameters down at the end with names so you know what they are and they're position independent. Lots and lots of applications like GitHub use this kind of a system, and they think that it's appropriate to bury all these parameters in the middle of their URL. The advantage of burying them is it gets you some advantage for caching, but in reality, the caching systems are very sophisticated at caching, and you can cache just as well with named parameters as with positional ones. So I'm not certain that argument really holds up. Lots of people think that this is a clearer way to do it with positional parameters. That's not been shown to be the case in compiler language development and people that have actually researched it. It's kind of a naive opinion. So some of these systems provide this capability. Sometimes it's really useful and really good for various reasons, but lots of times it just makes it more difficult to get the routing done and to understand how it works.